Okay, so the question on this one, as you can see here, I built a scene. I'll walk through this in a second to show you how I built it. But the idea is that this white rectangle is what the camera can see. And we've got this enemy out here who's going back and forth. And maybe you have a much bigger level where you have lots of enemies and you might need to conserve some CPU usage. And there really isn't any reason to be drawing this guy right now because he's not interacting with our player at all. He's too far away. And so we're wasting our time, drawing this thing. So and doing whatever else he's doing. And there may be, in this case, it probably won't matter because there's only one. But if you have hundreds of these things, then it might matter because really what you want to be concerned with is what you're rendering on your camera, and that can interact with these things and make changes in the world that will affect the player. And in this case, if this thing is moving or not, it's not going to affect the player at all. And so we are going to put some stuff in here so that this thing doesn't actually get created until we get pretty close to it. And there's a few different ways you can do that. One of them is we're going to build an empty game object. This thing is a gnome, so we'll have a gnome spawner. And we can put a script on the gnome spawner who's constantly checking for the distance between him and our little guy here. And when that gets within a certain range, then the gnome spawner instantiates one of these guys, and then it'll work out. The other way is that the gnome spawner could have like a circle trigger collider on it that will get triggered when this thing walks closer to it. Both doing the exact same thing, just two different implementations of it. So we're going to work on that right now. So this gnome here, I'm going to drag it down. Oh, let's walk through what I've got here. I've got a gnome image and a gnome object, and the gnome has a box collider and a rigid body, and it has an enemy mover script, which I'll show you in a sec. Our little Jujubee guy here in the scene, he has a rigid body and a box collider, and also has a player controller script on it. And the main camera, I made a child to it, so it will follow it around. And then this big rock here is just a little thing that I stretched out and gave it a box collider so we have something to walk on. All of these are Glitch the Game assets. So, and we've done this camera stuff in other tutorials, so if you need a little bit more camera help, you can look through some of those or shoot me an email or something. But I wanted to get all this set up so we could go through it pretty quick. But let's look at our scripts. We have our player controller really doesn't do anything. It's just looking to make sure that if the right arrow is pressed, we're going to move our guy over to the right. We're not jumping, we're not doing anything. We're keeping this as bare bones as possible. The enemy mover is pretty bare bones as well, and we talked about this before, but just to walk you through it, when this thing first starts up, we get the position of where our gnome is. We have two public variables, the distance, how far it travels before it turns around, and the speed, how fast it's traveling before it turns around. And then in our update loop, we keep track of the direction. So in this case, direction of a 1 means we're going to the right, -1 means we're going to the left. We multiply it by our speed and increment our x position. And then over here, we check and see if we're going too far to the right. Then we set our direction to go to the left. And in this one, if we're moving to the left and we're too far to the left, we're beyond where we started, then we turn around and go back the other way. There's more that we could do with this as far as flipping the scale to make it look nicer, and maybe we should do some acceleration. But that's not the point. We're not making the perfect enemy. We're just showing how we can spawn this thing when we get close. So let's get back to it. So I'm going to take my gnome and just drag it down here to make a prefab out of it so that we can instantiate this thing later. And I will delete this out of our scene. And so now we don't have this thing over here. I'm going to create an empty game object, and we'll call it Gnome Spawner. And where is this thing? I'm going to put it over here. And the idea is this, when we get within a certain distance of this, we will spawn a gnome. And I'm going to put a script on this thing, C# script. We'll call it Gnome Spawner. And I'll put that on our empty game object here. And so what we need to know is, where is this guy in our script? We need to know the position of this guy. We'll know our position. we'll see the distance, and then we'll put in some threshold, and when we get close enough, we will spawn this gnome that we also need to know about. So in this gnome spawner, we will have a public game object. Let's just call it enemy. What is this thing? And we need to have a public float distance. And then inside the update loop, we just want to say if vector2 dot distance between our position, which is this empty game object, and the gnome, which is the enemy, enemy.transform.position. If that is less than our distance, then we need to spawn our enemy. Spawn our enemy like this. And we'll make a new function, void spawn enemy. And what do we need to do in there? We need to instantiate the enemy at our location, which is the location of that empty game object. And the rotation will just be quaternion.identity. We don't need to change that. And then the other thing we want to do is destroy game object. Destroy ourselves. So we're going to create an enemy right where we're at, and then we'll destroy ourselves. And then that way we'll only do this once because we're going to destroy ourselves right away. You want to make sure that you do destroy this object. If you want to leave it in there, you'll have to put some sort of boolean or something so you don't spawn a million of these things. So if we go back to Unity, and here's my Gnome Spawner, it needs to know what the enemy is. And I'm going to drag in the prefab. Remember, it's not the image. There's two different things here. Here's the image. Here's the prefab that has all these things on it. So I'm going to, in our Gnome Spawner, I will drag in the gnome. And the distance, let's just say, I'm just going to guess, let's just say 1. So when we get within 1 unit, this thing should spawn. Let's see what happens. Here's our scene, so we must not be far enough. And let's go to game. And where are we? Oh, we passed it. So let's see what happened. So it seems like this probably should have happened, but I wonder why not. Oops. Save our scene. So our Gnome Spawner. The distance is less than 1. So maybe we never got within 1 distance, 1 unit. So let's change this. What if it's 100? So this should go right away, I would think. And there, it did go right away. So if we look on our scene, we have this thing here. So our distance of 1 was probably just too small. We never got within 1 unit. So I am going to, let's see, where are we at? This is my guy. He's at -8, -3, and this is at -22, or at 22. But it is kind of up in the air a little bit. So well, let's just say, how about 5? That was too big. And let's make it a 2. Okay, so at a 2, we're still okay. This thing is not moving back and forth. As I approach it, it's there. And we passed it. So the distance between this thing and that are probably, let's move it down. just going to move this thing down and see if we can get this thing to spawn. There it goes. Okay, so let's try it again. So I sort of moved the position of the Gnome Spawner so that it would be within our range of actually hitting it. And let's go back to our scene. And we already passed it. Oh, it didn't save it. That's right. Since we were running, it didn't save it. So I'm going to move this thing back down again, like down to here. And let's run again and see what happens. Here's our scene. Here we are. Here's that. And we passed it, and it still didn't go. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to unplay this thing and change our distance to 3. And then let's see. But I mean, you could play around with these distances, or instead of guessing, you could actually calculate it. So when I went here, 3 is too big. Let's make it a 2.5. Oops. Well, you know what? This is all kind of strange. I am going to print out the distance here just so we know what's going on, because it seems like there's weird things happening. So I'll put in here debug.log. I'll just copy this whole thing. And then we'll do it with a trigger later, which is the preferred way to do it, but I wanted to show 2 different ways. So now we're at 2.6, constantly at 2.6. Oops. And why is that? So the distance was never changing. Oh, ha. This is really ridiculous. All right, so poor planning. The other thing we need to know is public transform player. And this is the player. And that's what we should be doing our distance, not the enemy. The enemy is what we actually spawn. So sometimes I tried to go fast, and it's best to just take your time and print out what is actually happening. So I'm going to change this to player. And now when we go back to this thing, now there is room here for our player, which is our little jujube guy. I can stick that in there. And so when I hit play, now we're 31 units away, and we're actually getting closer. You can see as it's getting closer here. Pretty soon, we should be within 2.5, and then it starts spawning. So 2.5 was really small now because it spawned it right here. And we want to spawn it just when it's off, essentially when it's off screen. So I don't know, let's make that like an 8 or something. And then let's run and see when that thing starts to spawn. So now we're cruising, there's our distance. We're going down 8, it starts spawning, but it still shows up pretty much in the middle. So let's make it a little bit bigger, about 16, and go. $16 was still over here, so let's try it a little bit bigger. 21. And we're going, so far nothing. As soon as it gets to 21, it's going to spawn. There it goes. So now it's spawned. Where's our scene? It spawned just outside of our camera. Here's our camera. There it is. And if we go back to our game, now we'll see it. So yeah, that was a really roundabout way to do it. And I made a mistake in the initial script where I didn't keep track of our player, which is what we were supposed to be keeping track of. So no big deal. We did end up putting in a debug statement, which helped clear up exactly what's going on. So I'm going to get rid of that because we don't need it. So that is one way to do it. The other way to do it is instead of all this crazy scripting thing that we have going on with, checking this distance, we could actually put on our empty game object, we could add a circle collider and make it a trigger, and then we could change the radius of it like this. And so we could say whenever our Jujubee gets gets in here, then it would trigger it to turn it on, or it could be a bigger radius like this. You just have to find the distance, and then whenever this Jujubee collides with this trigger, then we spawn it. So instead of looking at the distance, we would do something like void on trigger enter 2D collider 2D call. And this script is on our Gnome Spawner, so if call.gameObject.tag equals player, then we'll spawn the enemy like that. And then we'll have to go back and make sure that we tag this with player. And I can comment out this code. And as long as all that is good, it should actually work. Let's see. There it is. So it's the same thing in a way. And our guy is gone, our spawner is gone, but it essentially does the same thing. It's just a little bit easier to see because when you're in your scene and you have your Gnome Spawner, you can say that when this guy collides inside of this is when I start to spawn this thing here. And it doesn't have to be a circle collider. You can put a box collider around this or whatever. It doesn't matter. But as long as it's a trigger, things will work and things will fire. As long as your trigger is set and your player's tag is set, that will all work as well. So you can play games with the distances like I was doing. The idea was I was going to show you how this was kind of hard to figure out what this distance was. And I started making all kinds of problems, including not passing in this correct player. And so yeah, there's a lot of ways to make mistakes when you do it this way. This is probably the preferred way to do it, by using a trigger and setting the radius so that you know when you collide with this thing is when you start to spawn. That's probably the preferred way to do it. So, so yeah, that was the simple way. I wanted to show you a hard way, but I ended up making it way harder than I should have. So anyways, that's how you spawn enemies as you get close to them.